What's going on, friends? Welcome back to another New World video. One thing I often find can be very confusing for new players is figuring out what a good item looks like. When you're leveling up, and especially when you hit the max level, New World Aeternum tends to flood you with weapons, armor, jewelry, and I think it can often be quite challenging to sort through what you've got and figure out what's worth keeping, what you should be selling, and what you should just go ahead and, salvage straight away. So today we're going to be going through some S tier perks for different pieces of gear in New World Aeternum and talking about what makes them good and what an ideal combination of perks on an item would look like. But first, a quick word from this video's sponsor. Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus is an exciting turn-based strategy game set in the eternal conflict of Games Workshop's Warhammer 40,000 universe. In Tacticus, you'll assemble and lead a squad of more than 70 legendary Warhammer 40,000 champions from 17 unique playable factions. They're adding more champions and factions all the time, so if you're a fan of the franchise, it's super likely you'll see some familiar names. You can fight against or strategize with other players in high-stakes tactical battles, and Tacticus has a ton of different game modes for you to play through, like the PvE campaign, PvP arena, live events, guild raids, and more. So to join in, you can download and play the game for free today by clicking the link in the description down below or scanning the QR code that you see on the screen now. Thank you to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for sponsoring this video. Now, before we really jump into the meat of this video, I want to briefly outline a few things as some disclaimers before we really get into things. So the first one I want to talk about is what we're covering in this video I would describe as this, best in slot. It's a very difficult thing to nail down, what is the best possible item in the game, because there's so many different ways to play this game, and people have slight variations on what abilities they use, what perks they use, what sort of content they're going into. Are you going to be fighting other players? Are you going to be fighting against the AI? If it is the AI, are you going to be doing the raid? Are you going to be doing mutate at the depths or something? Different perks and different items are good in different situations, but I'm going to be trying to do my best to give you an overview. So for example, I'm going to be talking about a perk called Enchanted Ward. So it's right here, and it says you take less damage from light and heavy attacks. Now, spoilers, I'm going to be saying that this is a very good perk for almost all builds, but somebody in the YouTube comments might be like, well, Baggins, when I'm doing a flamethrower 1v1 where we just stand next to each other and both use flamethrower, Enchanted Ward doesn't do anything. And you would be right. Enchanted Ward is not very good against a flamethrower in a flamethrower 1v1. But in most situations in the game, it is a very good perk, and we're going to dive into why that is. One other concept that I want to talk about is perk categories. So again, this is another layer of complexity to this, but most perks in the game, they fall into a category. So we were just talking about Enchanted Ward. It has the label Damage Absorb. And what that means is if you have Enchanted Ward on your armor, in theory, you can't have any of these other perks on your armor as well. So you typically have to make the choice between, do you want Enchanted Ward, or would you like Grit Ward, or would you like Shirking Fortification, or would you like Elemental Aversion? Now, there are some items in the game that break the rule, and they have both Elemental Aversion and Enchanted Ward, and we're going to talk about those later, but typically, you might be asking, well, why would we not have both of the perks? Because, I would say both Elemental Aversion and Enchanted Ward are very good perks. So why don't we just have both of them? Well, we can't. The game forces you to choose, and this can be represented with a lot of other perks in the game as well. For example, if we talk about Vicious, this is a perk you can get on your weapon. Vicious is, again, a very strong perk. You would like to have it in a lot of places. But it is the damage con label. So if you have Vicious, you can't have Enchanted. If you have Enchanted, you can't have Rogue. If you have Rogue, you can't have Vicious. Again, there are a few items in the game that break the rule, and they allow you to have both. And those items, generally very good. But I just wanted to briefly explain that items fall into buckets, effectively. And if you have one perk from that bucket, you can't have any of the other perks unless it's an item that breaks the rules. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about is old perks. As you are leveling up and from a few pieces of content, you're going to get some old items. They're still around in the game, and they have perks that you'll no longer find at max gear score. So the max gear score right now is 725 at time of recording. Although for most people, we're going to be just working towards 700, especially if you're on the fresh start servers. But on occasion, you're going to find these items with refreshing evasion. Refreshing ward is another example of a perk. I don't know if I have any here. Let's just see if we have some real quick. It was a really good perk back in the day. Yeah, here we go, refreshing ward. So whilst there are some old items that do have really good perks, we're just going to be talking about items and what's available at stuff at 700 gear score. So if you are curious as to why I don't talk about these older perks, it's because they're not available at max gear score, although some of them are really, really good. And there is something to be said, like for instance with 3v3 Arena and Outpost Rush, it does scale you up to 700 gear score, so you can take some of those old items and use them, and they would be very powerful. But again, we're just generally going to be talking about what is relevant at 700 to 725 gear score, because, you know, that would be the best in the game right now. All right, so with all those disclaimers out the way, let's talk about perks for your armor first. How do you know if you have a good piece of armor? What are some good perks to be looking for on your armor? Well, spoilers, we already covered it at the start of the video, but I think a perk that you almost always want to have on your armor in almost all situations is Enchanted Ward. It says you take less damage from light and heavy attacks, and this works for both the AI and other players. It turns out that most damage in the game, I would say like 50% of your damage from players, unless they're using like a rapier, which is very ability centric, or maybe a fire staff, but certainly with bows, with hatchets, with great swords, with muskets, a lot of damage that you take is simply going to be just like this. This is a light and heavy attack. If I go over to the rapier, this would be a light attack. This would be a heavy attack, and then a bow. Again, if we're shooting arrows, that's a light attack, that's a heavy attack. And indeed, most abilities from bosses and stuff in the game as well. One website we're going to be using to help us explain things in this video is New World Buddy. I'll put a link to this in the description down below, but it gives you a breakdown of all the different attacks from bosses in the game. So Typhon, which is, I would say, one of the hardest bosses in the new raid. If we take a look through the different attacks that Typhon does, we have a heavy attack, heavy, 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 heavy. One magic, light, heavy, 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 light, heavy, light, heavy. You can see that in most cases, if you were to wear Enchanted Ward, it would be reducing heavy and light attacks. Whereas if we were to use Elemental Aversion, which I do think is pretty good, there's only 2 attacks that it's going to work against. Now, it is a little bit different with Broodmother Medusa. She does have quite a few magical attacks where Elemental Aversion would kick in. But in general, I just think the application is that you know, if we take a look at the way that you're going to be taking damage most of the time, it is generally light and heavy attacks, and therefore Enchanted Ward, it's just one of those perks that if it's on the armor, it's already like pretty good. You know, it is a default that you want to be aiming for. If the other perks are really good, then you could look for Elemental Aversion or something instead, but this is just a staple perk that is good in almost all builds, and it's applicable to almost all forms of damage that you take across the board. Right, so with Enchanted Ward out of the way, we understand like why that, I would say, is like the numero uno perk on your armor. Let's kick into some other perks that are generally pretty good, but I wouldn't say it's like an absolute must-have. So I've got a few different armor setups over here, and I want to run through why I think these would be some good combinations. So in our example armor set 01, again, I'll link these in the description down below, as along with the website. If you just want to take a look through as like a recap after this video, they'll all be in the description down below. But this is the first set that I've put, so this would be for more like a tanky kind of build. And as you can see, we've got Enchanted Ward in a lot of places, but another perk that I think is very good on your armor, and this is going to be the case in most situations, is health. It just gives you extra health, and it turns out that's typically pretty good for everybody. Maybe not for people who don't have much health, or people who are like very glass cannon. You know, if you're just looking to kill somebody before they kill you, then there certainly would be some better perks. But health is another one of those perks that I would say, you know, if you see Enchanted Ward and health on a piece of armor, you're looking really, really good. Like that's a great start. And then for the third perk, another one, like I would say this is the sort of holy trinity, would be health, Enchanted Ward, and refreshing, as we can see here on this hoplite helm. And again, these the names of these items, you don't have to be specifically farming for these items. It could be anything else. I just use these as representations. So I wouldn't really get hooked up on what the items are called when we go through this guide. This is more just to talk about the perks down here, rather. So health, Enchanted Ward, refreshing. Refreshing, you can have up to 4 of these on all of your items. So you can have refreshing on your gloves, your legs, your boots, and your earring. You don't want to go above 4 stacks because it doesn't do anything after that, but refreshing just allows you to use your abilities more often. That's going to be kind of good for everybody. Everybody likes to be able to use their abilities more often. Other perks that I consider to be very good are slash conditioning, and then we also have thrust conditioning as well. So I wonder if we can go in here. We just search for thrust conditioning. Turns out a lot of damage in the game either falls into the slashing or thrust category. There is also strike conditioning, but I think the way striking damage, it's usually like a big attack rather than sort of smaller incremental attacks, and smaller sort of more consistent attacks is where this conditioning perk comes in handy, because every time somebody hits you with a slashing attack, so they swing at you with a sword, again, this could be PvP, fighting other players, or PvE, AI, you're just going to take less damage from the next hit, and the more pieces of gear that you have, or the more perks you have on the pieces of gear, the stronger the conditioning becomes every time. So I think slash conditioning, thrust conditioning, also I would say S tier, along with health, enchanted ward, and refreshing. Some new perks that have come in that I do think from a PvP perspective would definitely be worth running are Thorny Reflection. You can have this on your gloves or your chest, if I'm not mistaken, or it might be your helmet, but there's only a couple pieces of gear this can be on. I think Thorny Reflection is actually looking pretty good. So for those of you interested in PvP, getting that on one piece of gear, along again with the health, the enchanted ward, the refreshing, or the conditioning, looking like a pretty solid item there. And then finally, something else that is worth looking at is Hasted Vigor. It reduces the potency of incoming damage over time effects. If you have a burn, a bleed, a poison on you, it reduces it, and it also gives you a movement speed while you're being affected by that damage. I think that's very viable in a lot of situations as well. And finally, the other thing that I want to talk about on your armor that is always going to be good for everybody is a weapon perk. Now, this is kind of tricky to break down because it's not like you always want to be looking for Insatiable Gravity Well, but a lot of weapons in the game, we have an example here with that piece that I showed earlier. You do want to be looking for these perks that are going to benefit your playstyle. So Leeching Flurry, Insatiable Gravity Well, Fortifying Sacred Ground. I wonder if I have any other pieces. Refreshing Pillar of Fire. There are these weapon perks that you can seek out, and some are better than others, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later on in the video. But typically going for these weapon perks as well, those are going to be a huge boon to your gear. So the sort of quick recap from Armor Set 1 is that we want to be looking for Health, Enchanted Ward, one of the conditioning perks, or Refreshing, and then also weapon perks as well. So if you can see any combination of those, if that makes sense to you, friends, Health, Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, Health, Enchanted Ward, weapon perk, Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, weapon perk, Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, Thorny Reflection. Just, you get the idea. Some combination of those perks on a piece of gear, I think that's looking like a very solid item. Moving over to something that is a bit more PvP specific, but also very desirable to certain players, including yourself, is Shirking Heals. So again, this only works when you're fighting other players, but stacking this on lots of pieces of armor has generally been a popular build for a while. Along with Freedom as well. Freedom, again, this is more for a perk in PvP, but I think if we could look for an Enchanted Ward, Shirking Heals, Freedom, or again, Enchanted Ward, Shirking Heals, and we talked about those conditioning perks, those refreshing perks, taking anything from the first section of armor, the refreshing, the Enchanted Ward, the Thorny Reflection, as you can see on this piece of gear here, they're kind of interchangeable, but Enchanted Ward, Shirking Heals, and then any of the other S tier perks, I think would be a good combination. If you are going to play with Shirking Heals, it is generally advised that you look for Ankh. This is an artifact that comes from the PvP rewards track. So I'll just show you what that looks like, just in case you're unfamiliar. This is your PvP rewards track here. There's a chance for it to pop up on checkpoint 3. You're just going to have to do a lot. Typically, like, these artifacts are very tricky to get them to pop up. It does require a lot of time investment. But Ankh effectively is going to amplify the healing from all the other Shirking Heals you receive. So if you don't have a healer to play with, if you want to play more solo-centric PvP, if you find Shirking Heals on a piece of armor, especially if it's got Enchanted Ward, and then any of those other S tier perks, your Refreshing, Health, in this case Freedom, also very desirable in PvP, Thorny Reflection, Hasted Vigor, or just a good old weapon perk like I've outlined. Bleeding Sweep would be a good example. We'd play this build with a Spear, Bleeding Sweep, Enfeebling Skewer, Leeching Cyclone. Again, this is another example of a great perk combination on armor. I would say these are some BIS pieces for that particular playstyle. And then finally, another example of BIS, or best in slot. This would be a gear set for a Fire Mage. So if you were playing with a Fire Staff and a Blunderbuss, or a Fire Staff and a Rapier, having Fire Harnessing, and this is interchangeable if you were playing with the Bolt Caster, the legendary, the artifact bow that does lightning damage, then you would change this out for Lightning Harnessing. If you wanted to do a ice damage build, it would be Ice Harnessing. But these perks, whilst they're not applicable to everybody, right, unlike with the first example where Health, Enchanted Ward, Refreshing, kind of everybody can benefit from that. This is a bit more specific, but it still absolutely would be a best in slot item for a fire mage, and this harnessing perk could be interchangeable with any of the other elements for a specific mage that was looking to do that type of damage. One of the perk that I've showcased here as well, which I think is very, very good in a lot of situations, is Shirking Energy. You can only get these on light and medium legs if I'm mistaken, but Shirking Energy says if you dodge a hit, you get some stamina back, and anything that gives you stamina back is really, really good. So Shirking Energy is one of those perks that you can only find on legs, but that is a super desirable perk as well. So hopefully things are making sense here. I'm trying to build up a picture of some different perk combinations that you might see. A lot of what we've just showcased in this first section here, to recap, it would be your health, your refreshing, your enchanted ward, slash conditioning, thrust conditioning, harnessing, any weapon perks that you find desirable, and then in some cases for PvP, the hastened vigor, thorny reflection, freedom, shirking heals. And now what I briefly want to talk about is some items that I would still say are really good, but maybe not best. So if you see items with these perk combinations, you're still looking at something pretty solid. And this is just hopefully going to help reinforce the picture of, again, what I believe good items look like in New World Aeternum. So we've got the refreshing, we've got the enchanted ward, and then the third perk, not as desirable, but still pretty good. Vigor reduces the base duration of burn, bleed, and poison. So I think if you get two of the really good perks, and then your third perk is like one of the okay perks, you've still got a pretty good item. Another example is over here, Sturdy Energy. I would say this is a pretty good perk. Not quite as like universally strong and god tier as Health and Enchanted Ward or Refreshing, but Sturdy Energy still pretty desirable for a lot of players. And then we addressed this earlier, but Elemental Aversion, whilst it's weaker than Enchanted Ward, and you have to choose one or the other, if you had Health Refreshing, so if we still had two of those S tier perks, Elemental Aversion I would say is A tier, so two S tier perks and an A tier perk. We have another example over here, Enchanted Ward, Health, Invigorated, so in our A tier would be Invigorated, Vigor, Sturdy Energy, Elemental Aversion. So if we can get two really good perks and then one like pretty good perk, you still have a decent item. And finally down here, another perk that I would say I put in A tier, because again, this Shirking Fortification, it takes the same spot as Enchanted Ward. So if you have Enchanted Ward, you can't have Shirking Fortification, but it's still a pretty good perk in several builds. Not universally across the board, but again, we've got two good perks and then we have an okay perk, which end up being still a pretty good item, and that would be good for you to equip or sell. And then finally, I wanted to talk about some garbage. So if you have any of these perks on your armor, if you pick up an item and it has any of these perks, I think sadly the item is just going to be relegated to the bin, I'm afraid. Luck, I know there are going to be some luck and joys in the YouTube comments, but let's be honest, when it comes to fighting other players, or if you're trying to push the raid, again, if this was an Enchanted Ward, you'd be able to take less damage. If it was Refreshing, you'd be able to use your abilities more often. If it was Conditioning, you'd take less damage. If it was an ability, it just like, luck is, it just could be anything else, and it would actually be contributing to you doing more damage or taking less damage. But instead, it's just giving you a very, very mild increase at like better items. So if you're doing a chest run, if you're on your own, absolutely luck. But I think in group content, especially serious group content, this perk is a bit of a joke. Also, Critical Retribution, I just find it to be way too niche. A 20-second cooldown is a bit too long. The increase in crit chance just doesn't seem like it's worthwhile. So I think like a lot of the time this perk's pretty bad. And then we have some bad weapon perks over here. So these weapon perks, I think just kind of, they're really specific. Mortar Charge is just a meme ability. Shield Bash, I just think is too specific, doesn't do good enough stuff personally. Same with Thwarting Trip. The first attack hits a target with active grit. That's just very specific, and it's not going to happen very often. And then also getting some movement speed. Maybe this could be like fringe, but I do think all of these weapon perks, they're very, very, very rarely desirable. So nobody really wants these weapon perks, and as a result, if you find them, nobody's going to want it. Empowering Armor Breaker is also, I would put in that list. And Empowering Breaker, I don't like this. Maybe some people would if you're playing against a lot of tanky boys, but I also think this perk shows up a lot, and I personally find it to be undesirable as well. So these are your, what I would call bad perks, and they're on your armor, kind of makes the armor stinky. Next up, let's talk about perks on your weapons. Just like with armor, there is quite a bit of nuance here, so it isn't going to be one size fits all, but there are some general rules. Just like with your enchanted ward, your health refreshing, I think there are some perks that are consistently pretty good across the board in almost all situations. Now, in order to make things a little bit more digestible, unlike with the armor section, I've actually gone ahead and put together this graphic here. So I would say that some combination of these perks over here is generally going to be pretty good for most weapons, with the exception of things like Life Staff, because obviously Life Staff's not very damage oriented. But usually you want to be looking for Vicious or Rogue. You can't have both in most cases. Attunement, this doesn't specifically have to be Flame Attunement, just getting a little bit of extra elemental damage. Again, you can have Arboreal Attunement, which is for nature. You can have Frost Attunement, you guys get the idea. Keenly Jagged or Keenly Empowered end up being pretty good for most weapons, and also a weapon perk. It doesn't specifically have to be Cindering Shockwave, but weapon perks often just amplify the damage of certain abilities, so Empowering Fireball, Leeching Flurry, Fortifying Sacred Ground. You guys get the idea. Generally, not always, like we talked about that resupplying mortar charge, but generally weapon perks on your weapon, provided it's the right perk, is going to be good. Now, how would you know which are the right perks and which are the wrong perks? Again, stay tuned. We'll have a resource a little bit later on in the video for that. I also wanted to talk about some specific perks that aren't good everywhere, but they are really required for these particular weapons. So the Flail, Longsword, and Life Staff, I think they all really benefit from having Refreshing Move, just because the way those weapons are played. And then specifically just for the Life Staff, Blessed is like an absolute must-have perk as well. So this is for like all weapons, or generally most weapons, but then specifically for these weapons, Refreshing Move for the Flail, Longsword, Life Staff, Blessed just for the Life Staff, also very good. And then finally, if you're playing a bit more PvP orientated, I think Plagued Crits or Penetrating Backstab or Alacritus Punishment. Some of these perks are only available on certain weapons, but if you're looking to make a good PvP weapon, having one or even two of these, in the case of Alacritus Punishment and Plague Crits for a Fire Staff, could be kind of interesting, but these are also very desirable for your PvP weapons, and you're going to see these primarily when you're looking at your PvP rewards track. You might see some of those perks pop up as well, and if you did, maybe consider picking that item up. Now again, I really want to emphasize that what I'm talking about here, it isn't going to apply to everything, but just to give you guys some examples of what I think some good weapons would look like for PvE and for PvP, I've actually sort of pre-made these builds. And again, I'll link this resource in the description down below, but let's kick things off with our Blunderbuss, shall we? So a good set of perks for a PvE Blunderbuss. Let's say you wanted to take the Blunderbuss into a raid. I think this would be a pretty ideal combination here. So we got our Disdained Infliction. This is one of the new perks from the New World Aeternum. You can only get it from the raid, I think, but it is very good. Damage over time effect, so any burns that we put on them, any bleeds, is going to be extended, and you just do more damage to AI, which is great for PvE. Flame Attunement, Keenly Empowered, also very strong on the Blunderbuss. And then if we move over to the PvP variant, pretty similar. Instead, we've opted to go for Enchanted. Enchanted just ends up being pretty solid on the Blunderbuss because it does a lot of damage just through its light attacks anyway. Vicious is less good because the Blunderbuss doesn't have a very high crit chance, and its critical damage multiplier is not great, so anything that amplifies crit on the Blunderbuss ends up not being that great, so just modifying the raw damage instead is a pretty good way to go. Also, Plague Splitting Grenades, reducing healing, that ends up being very good in PvP, and I think Plague Splitting Grenades is a great ability to go for there. So there's our BIS for PvE and our BIS for PvP. I think if you had at least a couple of the perks on a Blunderbuss from anything here, so if you had a Flame Attunement Keenly Empowered Blunderbuss, or if you had a Plague Splitting Grenades Enchanted Blunderbuss, you're off to a good start. And then the third perk, again, you could pick from that list from the diagram that we just showed a little bit earlier in the video. Bow-wise, BIS is Penetrating Rapid Shot, Disdained Affliction, Keenly Jagged. Again, there are some variables here, so I don't always say this is hands down, nothing is better, but I would say that would make a pretty good bow. Again, we're looking at the raid or any sort of challenging PvE. And then for PvP, Arboreal Attunement, Keenly Jagged, and Enchanted. Enchanted could also be replaced with Vicious or Vorpal if you were feeling really spicy, landing those headshots. But again, I would say that's a pretty good bow for PvP. With the Fire Staff, again, we're looking at that Disdained Affliction. It just makes a lot of sense. The Fire Staff has a lot of burns on it. I also think Flame Attunement. I have the idea here is that we're going into the Hive of Gorgons raid, so that the sort of new raid that they introduced, a lot of the enemies there are weak to fire damage, so if we can really just ramp up that fire damage, I think that's going to help a lot. That's why we chose the 3 perks there. And for PvP, Alacritus Punishment does a lot of damage to players with haste. It turns out that a lot of people have haste. Like, for example, when anybody uses Berserk on the hatchet, that counts as haste. So you're just doing 15% extra damage to players who are using Berserk. Lots of bow players have haste. Lots of rapier players have haste. It's just very common. So just a free 15% extra damage makes a lot of sense to me. Flail typically ends up being a tanking weapon, so we're looking at some tanking perks here. I think these would be the 3 best for now. Once upon a time, I would say Crowded Bludgeon was better than Mending Vortex, but they have nerfed Crowded Bludgeon. You can't go infinite now, so I opted to go for these 3 perks here. And then for PvP, Burdening Smite is a crazy good ability. Extending people's cooldowns, it's the only way in the game that you can extend people's cooldowns, so it's pretty nuts. And then Refreshing Move, just so you can use Smite more often. And I think Trenchant Rend's pretty nice as well, just to apply to other tanks and people nearby. Just slap them with a heavy attack. Also, Jasper Gem versus Carnelian Gem, again, because Carnelian doesn't do anything in PvP, so I think these would be the ideal sort of gem setup as well. Moving over to the Great Axe, a really good PvE Great Axe I think would have Maelstrom, Refreshing Move, and Vicious. Great Axe ends up being a very ability-centric weapon, so the thing that Great Axe really brings to the fight is its abilities, so being able to use them more often, especially Maelstrom to apply Weaken, it's very nice. Vicious, also just because it's got a decent crit chance and the crit damage multiplier, so Vicious is pretty nice. And then in PvP, again, we got a similar sort of playstyle here. There are a lot of perks that could be interchangeable, but I think this would make for a pretty good PvP Great Axe as well. Crippling Move at nearly 50% slow is quite disgusting. Refreshing Move, so you can use your abilities more often, like your Gravity Well, like your Reap, like your Charge. And then I opted for Attunement. I think just the extra elemental damage is pretty awesome, but I think you could easily say that bottom perk could be Vicious, it could be Enchanted, something desirable down there. But the Greatsword in PvE, I had a bit of a tough time putting some perks together here, because there's, like, Trenchant Strikes competes with a lot of other perks, but I do think Trenchant Strikes is a must-have. Greatsword is a very heavy attack-centric weapon, so I thought that would be pretty good there. Flame Attunement, again, with that raid in mind. And then finally Keenly Empowered, just get some extra crit chance whenever we hit them in the back, basically. That's a guaranteed crit. And then moving over to our PvP Greatsword. I'm not entirely sure if I like penetrating the Empowered that much, but I do think it would make sense on that, because the Greatsword already has some inbuilt armor penetration, so you can just lean into that. But maybe there would be something better to go for here, but this is what I'm throwing up as a potential best Greatsword for PvP. Hatchet-wise, Rogue, Refreshing Move, Refreshing Torrent. I think this is just good for spamming Raging Torrent, basically. You just hit the enemy in the back continuously. This would be more from a DPS standpoint, so not tanking with the Hatchet, instead doing damage with the Hatchet. I think this is a great perk combination. And then for PvP, I really like Keen Berserk, but perhaps other people are going to seek out different things. The role of the Hatchet for me typically feels like it's sort of like a healer hunter. You're like healing people down in the back line, so going for those backstabs, a lot of a rogue playstyle. Funny enough, with the perk Rogue, I just think you're gonna destroy people very quickly with that combination of perks there. Ice Gauntlet in PvE. Ice Gauntlet's a bit of a tricky one because barely any of its abilities do crit. So Wind Chill doesn't crit. Ice Pylon can crit, Ice Storm does not crit, Ice Shower doesn't crit, Healing Tomb doesn't crit. There's only I only think 2 of its abilities can crit. So yeah, it's just going for anything that allows you to crit, not that good. So instead the idea here is that we put down the Pylon, and then we let the Pylon do stuff with Disdain Infliction and Flame Attunement. I've heard that the Pylon is particularly effective in the first boss of the raid. If you put it on top of the pillars, it does bonus damage. And then for PvP, I've gone for the Alacritus Punishment. Again, you can only get this on magical weapons, but it's pretty awesome. You put Ice Storm in a group of players, does 15% more damage to any of them that have haste. I also really like Unbroken Winds. Some people might consider it a bit of a meme, but I think it's a really fun perk to have on your weapon for the root and stuff to bully melee players. Also, 40% extra damage for an ability is kind of nuts. And Keenly Empowered, I guess if you can land a light or heavy attack, you get a crit. Then you can get the Keenly Empowered there. So we did say crits aren't very good, but I just thought land a light attack and then followed into Unbroken Winds. Gonna get some big damage there. Life Staffs are fairly similar. It's pretty straightforward with these. It's basically Blessed, Refreshing Move, and then a weapon perk. In PvE, I like Fortifying Sacred Ground. And for PvP, I like Refreshing Divine Embrace. Purity of Light, or Keen Beacon, or Mending Protection. They're all viable, but these are my go-to. So yeah, Blessed, Refreshing Move, and then a weapon perk basically for your Life Staff. For the Longsword, Again, this ends up being more of a tanking weapon in PvE, so if you're going to tank with the longsword, I think that's a great combination of perks there. Refreshing moves, so you can use your taunts more often, attunement for a little bit of extra damage, entrenchant rend. You want to be doing heavy attacks with the longsword to get your empowered stab passive, so trenchant rend just leans in pretty nicely. And then in PvP, I find that longsword actually ends up taking more the role of, like with the hatchet, it's more of an assassin kind of weapon. So you could play with a similar set of perks, you just have to change the gem, but you could take these same perks and use them in PvP for tanking if you wanted to be a PvP tank. But if you wanted to be a bit more of a sort of backline, chasing down healers, a bit of an assassin, I think this is a really disgusting combination of perks. I would say that's BIS for me, for the aggressive longsword play. With the musket, things are fairly similar. We've got Disdained Infliction, Flame Attunement, Keenly Jagged for PvE. Just lots of dots, lots of damage, lots of fire. Again, I built this with the raid in mind. And then for PvP, we've got that Disdained Infliction again, we got Keenly Jagged, and we've gone for Abyssal Attunement. The reason behind this is because Musket, I feel like, is best played with the artifact Void Gauntlet called Life Taker, which adds a little bit of extra void damage over time. So you can really lean into the void damage, and that's why we opted to go for that perk combination there for PvP. A best in slot rapier for PvE. There are a few different ways you could play this, but I think this is a great combination here. Lots of damage, omnidirectional evade, you can just spam it very often. Also, the rapier can put bleeds on, especially if you run flurry, which I think you would with this build. So Disdained Infliction ends up being pretty good. And then keenly empowered, because the rapier it doesn't really have much empower built into its kit, so if you can give it some extra empower, that's going to be nice. In PvP, again, we're going for that sort of assassin playstyle. It's typically the way that rapier would be played. Either that or you combine it with a life staff, but then your perks don't really matter that much. So for a DPS rapier in PvP, I think this would be a great combination of perks. On the spear, Skewer is a bonkers perk in PvE and in PvP as well. Just a 48% weaken, reducing the enemy's damage by half is so good. Disdained Infliction again just ends up being really good in PvE, and Flame Attunement with the idea that we're going into the raid and we're fighting against those Angry Earth enemies, being able to burn them for extra damage, kind of nice. In PvP, you could replace that Leeching Cyclone with Skewer, but Leeching Cyclone is really nice to stay alive in PvP. And again, the idea with these perks here is that we're sort of hunting down healers. So we've got the Pen Backstab and the Rogue. We're just trying to get those backstabs. As people run away from us, we hit them for a lot of damage, kill them very quickly. Void Gauntlet, no surprises here. Disdained Infliction again, just ends up being really good for most weapons. If the weapon has any form of dot that it can apply, and with the Void Gauntlet, it does the Disintegrate dot, so damage over time, void damage over time. Putrefying Scream is crazy good for reducing healing. And interestingly enough, Void Gauntlet is one of the few weapons in the game that really likes crits. It really wants to crit because it gives you a lot of cooldown reduction. So although Keen generally isn't a desirable perk, because the Void Gauntlet has on critical heal, you get 15% of your damage. Oh, sorry, on your crit, you heal 15% of your damage. Cooldown reduction on critical hit. There's a lot of synergies with critical, basically. So if you crit more often, you heal, you get cooldown reduction. So I think Keen actually makes a lot of sense. Although it is worth mentioning that if you hit the enemy in the back, it is a guaranteed crit. So if you knew that you were going to be reliably backstabbing enemies, maybe don't go for Keen. And then over in PvP, probably no surprise, but Alacritus Punishment, again, just really nice. Played crits, as we talked about it. The Void Gauntlet is a crit machine, so being able to apply disease, and then really being able to apply disease, just like the idea here is just mass applying reduction and healing to lots of people with the Plague Crits, Putrefying Scream, and some extra damage from Alacritus Punishment. And then finally, we got our Warhammer. Sundering Clear Out, Trenchant Strikes, and Flame Attunement. This is with the tanky Warhammer in mind. Being able to apply big rend to the bosses. Trenchant Strikes, just doing some big damage with the heavy melee attacks. Warhammer is a sort of heavy attack centric weapon. And Flame Attunement just to really burn down those Angry Earth bosses in the Hive of Gorgons raid. And then in PvP, Sundering Shockwave, Thwarting Strikes, Arboreal Attunement. Thwarting Strikes applies to almost all of the Warhammer's abilities. I think 5 of the 6 Warhammer abilities have grit. So just giving 7% extra damage to all of your Warhammer abilities, and whenever you do a heavy attack, there's a passive that can give you grit on the Warhammer skill tree. So I think the Thwarting Strikes makes a lot of sense. Attunement, the Warhammer doesn't attack very often, so I think you can get Attunement on every single attack. And Shockwave is a staple, and applying a sort of rend that lasts for 10 seconds is kind of nice on an AoE ability as well. I also briefly wanted to talk about round shields and tower shields. Kite shields don't get used very often, in case you're wondering why we don't talk about a kite shield. So BIS for a round shield. Again, this is the idea that you're going a bit more aggressive. The cool thing about round shield paired with the sword is that you can sort of stack the two together. So we have enchanted, keenly jagged, and enchanted ward, and that stacks with the perks on your sword. So we would have penetrating backstab, empowering leaping strike, keen speed, and then you would also give these 3 perks to the sword as well. So you can have like 5 or 6 aggressive perks on your sword, which is pretty insane. So for sort of very damage orientated sword, and I guess you could do it with the flail as well. That's less common though. And then for tower shield for the big tanky boy, we have 2 different options here for PvE and PvP. So if you're going to be tanking the raid or something like that, fortifying shield rush, and then there is these perks that you can get. So if I go over here, I'll show you guys. This can be interchangeable depending on what you're going against. So slash shield ward, but it could also be fire shield ward or flame shield ward, thrust shield, void shield. I think over a long period of time, you kind of want to get a little bit of everything. So you want to try and get a shield with this, and then this one, you want to have like one of every different type. So you'd want to have one with thrust, one with void, one with frozen, one with flame. You guys get the idea. And then the other perks would stay the same. And finally, for PvP, I think Sturdy Fortification, switching that out for the ward perk, although this would be great in PvP as well, to be honest. But Sturdy Fortification only works in PvP. When you block, you get Fortify, so you can get a 25% Fortify. It's pretty nice, you know, 25% Fortify works pretty well. And it covers everything, unlike with the Shield Ward, which is only one particular type of damage. The Fortify just increases your armor against everything. Alright, and finally, friends, it's time to talk about jewelry and what good jewelry looks like. Now, thankfully, unlike with the weapon section and the armor section, this one it's going to be a bit more quick. You know, there aren't that many perks. There's only a limited number of perks on jewelry, and only a few of them I think are really good. So let's jump into those. We're going to go back to New World Buddy again to show those off. First off, with the amulet, I think there are 3 sort of cut and dry perks that you pretty much always want to go for. The first one is health, just having extra health. Almost kind of good for everybody. Like, who doesn't like having an extra big health pool? Gonna die less often, fantastic. Stamina recovery, this perk did get nerfed, but I still think it's really good. When you drop below 50% health, you get half of your stamina bar back. That's really good. That gives you an extra dodge, sometimes 2. So stamina recovery and health, I think, are the staple. And then the third perk is going to be flexible depending on what you're going into. So this could be flame protection, it could be frost protection, it could be thrust protection. But I would generally recommend one of these protection perks. So we could have thrust protection if we were going to be going against a lot of bows, or if we were playing against a boss that we knew did a lot of thrusting damage. Slash protection for like Captain Thorpe, for example, final boss of the depths. And we would want to change the gem accordingly as well. So if we did want to build the ideal amulet for fighting against Captain Thorpe, then we would want to grab a moonstone. So that would give us 5% slash damage absorption and another 15% slash damage absorption. So Captain Thorpe would be doing 20% less damage to us with his greatsword. Or hatchet players, again, they'd be doing 20% less damage to us. But inversely, if we were going into the Empyrean Forge, so we were fighting against the big fire snake lady and Commander Meatball, then these perks here, this would give us 21% fire damage absorption, or if we're playing against fire staff. So yeah, I think the idea is get a lot of different amulets. The base perk on the amulet, health and stamina recovery, and then the final perk, you want to be looking for like the Exodia, so you want to get one of each type for every different type of protection. That's like the ultimate long-term goal, but I'd be pretty happy with an amulet like this for my new character. I think it would cover me in a lot of situations, especially if you're more PvP oriented. Moving over to the ring, again, there are some perks that I think you always want to have. Hearty is the first perk, so Hearty just super good for everybody. Gives you an extra dodge roll effectively. We can demonstrate this hit real quick here, but if I take off my ring, if I do a dodge, and then I do a dodge, I'm out of stamina. That's it. But if I put the Hearty ring back on, go ahead and grab it from my gear set over here, and then I can do a dodge, I can dodge, and then I can dodge again. Having 3 dodges can often be a big game changer. It can save your life. So Hearty, kind of good for everybody. It's not as effective and heavy, but I would still say you go for it. And then other very desirable perks are going to be Leeching, Keen Awareness, and you can replace the Keen Awareness with some sort of damage perk. So if you wanted to be more specific, if you were going to play with a hatchet, for example, slash damage. If you were going to play with a bow, thrust damage. If you were going to play with a fire staff, fire damage. But I would think like Hearty, Leeching, and then basically this perk down here, If you want to get really specific, if you were playing with that Void Gauntlet build that we talked about in the weapons where you're applying a lot of disease, you could replace leeching with infected, so your disease lasts longer. I think that's pretty desirable there as well. Also, for those of you who are very PvP oriented, invigorated punishment is also pretty sweet. Abilities deal 1% bonus damage, so this could be like, this would be a really disgusting fire staff ring, for example. And then finally, I want to talk about the Dream Healer Ring. I really like having Hearty, Sacred, and then my final perk is Healing Breeze. Healing Breeze did get a bit of a nerf, but I still think it's pretty solid. So where is our Healing Breeze over here? This is my sort of Dream Healer Ring. That's what I would be looking for there. So yeah, there's not that many perks that are great on the ring. Hearty is pretty much always going to be one of them. If you don't have Hearty on your ring, generally not going to be great. And then the other two perks, it's going to be a combination of what we just talked about. And then finally, over on the earring, there is quite a bit of variety here. I think Refreshing Toast, just so you can use your potions more often. That's going to be kind of good for everybody. I also do like to just slap Refreshing on my earring, so then it frees up some perks on my armor, so I can put Enchanted Ward, because you can't have Enchanted Ward on your earring. You can't have health on your earring. You can't have conditioning on your earring, so I just think like Refreshing is a perk that you can get on so many different pieces of gear. And the earring isn't like super competitive. There aren't that many amazing perks on the earring, so Refreshing Toast and Refreshing generally my go-to. And then this third perk down here, going to be interchangeable depending on what you want to do. So Regenerating for more health. Then there's also for tanks in PvP, Despised is like a must-have in my opinion. Generating extra threat is going to be really good. Healing Heart, I think, has some application. It's, you know, just if you want to pop Stone Form to get some extra, so when you pop your Heart rune, you get a heal. And then finally, I also think Fortifying Toast or Empowering Toast when you drink a potion can be pretty good as well. So drinking a potion, and then you're like a little bit stronger for the next 8 seconds, kind of makes a sense. Health potion, and then you've got more armor, or you're doing more damage. I think one of the Empower, the Fortify, or even the Purifying Toast can be pretty good as well. Alright, and finally, just to throw a bit of confusion into the mix, there are these unusual items that you can get throughout New World. There's not that many of them, but some of them, they just do really weird things. So the Sandworm Raid in particular, it has a helmet that has Savior on it. Now this is a perk that can only be gotten on the life staff, but for some reason it's on a helmet, which is just all kinds of insane. And as a result, I mean, that's really good. Like, this is really, really good. So this would be absolutely best for a healer. Getting Keen, again, this is a weapon perk, but it's on your chest. And I think just increasing your crit chance with a perk on your armor, super desirable. Keenly Empowered on legs also. So that the Sandworm has some really unusual pieces of gear. Not sure if this is going to be fixed or this is intended. It does turn out that the Sandworm, by the way, for those of you curious, you can find it in activities. And then you go to Elite Trials. You can get them from here, but this is really, really difficult right now. Like only a few groups in the world have completed it, but some insane perks in there. One thing I also want to point out as well is the Frigid Dawn armor. So I think Frigid Dawn only comes from doing Mutated Glacial Tarn. So we don't have it right now at time of recording, but in the cycle over here, you might get Glacial Tarn mutated. If you can get into that, if you can do difficulty 1, 2, or 3, you'll get some Frigid Dawn armor. This is very good because it has Enchanted Ward and Elemental Aversion. So you could have Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion Refreshing, Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion Health, Enchanted Ward, Elemental Aversion Conditioning. Just like a really good item because it's got these two that normally can't be on, but you can get it specifically with this piece of gear. And then again, we got some more weird funkiness from the Sandworm where you can get Keen Speed on a pair of boots. Again, that's really nice. And there are these old items as well. We talked about it at the beginning of the video, but normally you can't have slash damage and keen. It's one or the other, but the Legate's Ring allows you to have both. I think this is still like pretty easy to get right now. And as we talked about in the beginning of the video, it would get scaled up to 700 gear score and Outpost Rush. So if you don't want to go for Hearty, like maybe if you're playing in heavy armor, Hearty isn't that desirable, then you could run the Legate's Ring, getting the 2 perk combo. Pretty wild there. And finally, this is an earring that you're going to get from the main story quest line, and it's got a gem in it that is the weapon equivalent. So when you put this gem in your armor or your jewelry, it's supposed to give you strike damage absorption. This is only what's supposed to happen to the gem when you put it in your weapon, but for some reason it is giving you the weapon equivalent of the gem in your earring, and that ends up being really nuts as well. So specifically for game modes that have gear score scaling, like 3v3 Arena and Outpost Rush, this is actually a pretty insane earring as well. Okay, friends, so that's pretty much going to do it. I know that was a lot of information to digest, but one thing, as we mentioned at the beginning of the video, I do have these resources. Now, flashbang warning, this is going to be a bright screen, so for those of you watching on your phone or whatever, or you're in a dark room, we're about to show a bright white spreadsheet. Here we go. So this was a resource that I made a while ago. This was from Season 4, so the end of 2023. I haven't updated the list yet, but hopefully by the time this video goes out, we're going to have this updated. And we basically talk about what perks I think are S tier, A tier, B, C, D. Right now, I've just got it set up for PvE, so for like doing dungeons and the raid and stuff, but I will be updating this in the near future, and I'll be adding a PvP section as well. So if you just want a quick reference, if this video was too much information spread out and you wanted like a quick reference to look at, there'll be links to this along with all the other resources that I showed in the description down below. As always, friends, I hope you found this one useful. Again, BIS and good perks, it's really hard to explain in a clear and coherent way, but if nothing else, enchanted ward on your armor, that's pretty good. Refreshing in health, pretty good. And then for those weapons, typically it's some combination of vicious, keenly empowered, keenly jagged, and the other ones that we talked about, those weapon perks as well. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. If there is some better way to explain this, to if you can describe it in like a paragraph or less to people down below, if you want to do some TLDR or whatever in the comments, by all means. I just want to help people out when it comes to New World, because I know items can be quite confusing, especially with how many you get on a daily basis. If you want any more Baggins, if you want to talk about specific builds or anything like that, I'm live on Twitch almost every day, twitch.tv/BagginsTV. We're also giving out codes. We have skins that we're going to be giving away, so if you'd like a skin, you can get that by watching the stream as well. Links in the description down below. And quickly, we're going to go back to remind you guys about the sponsor. Once again, thanks to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for sponsoring this video. Make sure to use my link in the description down below or scan the QR code on the screen you see right now. You can download and play the game for free starting today.